We've all been in social situations, maybe a job interview or a first date, and you're asked, "So tell me about yourself." And if you're like me, maybe you have a 30-second elevator pitch that you usually share. Now, if someone pressed you a bit more and asked, "No, tell me who you really are," you'd probably answer with the story again, maybe about your job, your family, your past, or maybe you throw a label or two in there. Like, I'm a father, I'm genuine, I'm a lifelong learner, or maybe more revealing, I'm insecure, I'm anxious, I'm lost in life. These stories about your self-image helps you to make sense of your life to others as well as yourself. But acceptance and commitment therapy, or ACT, says that the same story can become the very thing that traps you in psychological suffering. ACT even has a word for this ongoing habit of turning experience into identity called selfing. And today I want to walk you through the three ways that ACT understands the self. The first way ACT talks about the self is self as content, your conceptualized self. It's the collection of labels, memories, roles, and judgments that your mind uses to answer the question, who am I? And this starts early. As a kid, your mind starts collecting information about who you are. What got praised, what got criticized, where you fit in, and where you didn't. Were you the smart one, the funny one, the troublemaker, the quiet one, the ghost? Over time, your brain weeds all of that into a narrative or a self-story. Here's where it turns into a trap. Say you go through a string of painful experiences, a few bad breakups, a job loss, years of feeling overlooked. Your mind doesn't just collect that information, it tries to make sense of it. And sometimes it writes painful headlines. I'm a failure. I must be unlovable. I am broken. And once a headline gets written, your mind starts defending it. They call this coherence, and our brain searches for coherence. We want things to align, even if it's a faulty self-image. So if your mind has latched onto I am a failure, it starts filtering reality through that lens. Someone gives you a genuine compliment, and your mind says, they're just being nice. An opportunity opens up, and your mind says, don't try, you just embarrass yourself. ACT calls this cognitive fusion. Now, fusion means you're no longer seeing thoughts as thoughts. You're treating them like reality, as if they're literally true. I am a failure stops feeling like one sentence that your mind produces and starts feeling like a fact carved into the universe. It's so clear. And once you're fused with a painful self-story, your life starts to shrink, doesn't it? You stop taking the risk. You stop reaching out. You avoid the very things that could prove the story wrong. That's why your self-identity can become a trap, because it actually becomes self-sabotage. Not because every story is false, not because your past doesn't matter, but because when you get fused with your self-story, you stop living from your values and start living to protect that story. The instinctive move here is to argue with it, fight. I'm a failure with, no, I'm not a failure. I'm successful. I'm capable. I'm amazing. But if all you do is argue with the story, you're still stuck inside that story. Your argument is according to that story. You're still treating the problem as if the goal is finding the correct label. Swap failure with successful. Swap weak with strong. And call it healed. But what if freedom isn't about winning the identity argument? What if it comes from changing your relationship to the entire process of labeling? So that is self as content. But there's a second way that ACT understands the self, called self as process. This means noticing your experience as it's happening in real time. Think about the difference between reading a finished biography of yourself and then seeing a live video feed of what's happening in your body and mind right now. Well, that's two different experiences. One has happened and one is happening in the moment. Self as content might say, I'm a failure. Self as process would say, I'm noticing my mind telling me that the story is I'm a failure. It's the same thing, but it's completely different relationship. For example, if I say I'm anxious, anxiety sounds like it's core part of who I am, that it's stable, permanent, defining. If I say I'm noticing anxiety, something then shifts. It's something that's going from here to out here. Anxiety becomes something I'm aware of in the moment, something that's showing up right now, which means it can also rise, soften, and pass. For example, if Linda is experiencing anxiety at 2 o'clock because she has a meeting that's coming up at 2:15, at 2:05, she may be feeling hungry. She may be out of the anxiety and into a state of hunger. All right. So there's two different processes going on. There's a process at 2 o'clock and the process at 2:05. Now, this is one of the most simple and powerful moves in ACT. You move from I am this to the content to I am noticing this process. From I always mess up to I'm noticing my mind predicting that I'll mess up. I mean, that's a simple but powerful shift. Now, this doesn't make the feeling disappear. ACT isn't saying just notice your anxiety and it magically vanishes, but it softens it and you become curious about your experience. You're not locked into it. It begins to notice that it changes and shifts as the present moment continues. Now, that space gives you back your choice. You can then notice the shame that might be showing up and still tell the truth. You can notice that anxiety is showing up and still decide your next move according to your values. Now, that's why I built the free resource Act of Selfing. Now, this is a worksheet for understanding what's in your head is one thing, and then catching yourself doing it in the moment as another. This worksheet walks you through spotting your own labels as they show up and shifting the language from I am to I'm noticing. So the link will be in the description and pinned in the comments below. So I mentioned two forms of selfing, self as content and self as process. But there's also a third and final way. And this is the deepest way that ACT understands the self, and it's self as context. It's also known as the observing self. Think back on your life when you were 8 years old. Your body has completely changed since then. I've grown about 1.5 feet. I probably gained another 100 pounds. Your beliefs, though, have also changed. Your roles have flipped 1,000 times, and you've gone from student to teacher and son to father. But there's still some sense in which you were still then and you still are now. There's a sense of perspective that has not shifted or changed throughout all that time. There's a you that is consistent. There's an I that is looking out. Not an I as a fixed personality or a list of traits or a self-image, but an I as a perspective. Now, this is the place which experience gets noticed. That's what ACT is pointing to with the self as context. You're not just the thoughts and feelings that show up. You're not the roles that you play or the image that you create or the self-story that you create. You're also the space in which they show up. Now, picture this massive chessboard stretching out in every direction. The pieces on that board are your thoughts, feelings, memories, and labels. White pieces are the good stuff, joy, confidence. The label, I'm smart, I'm good enough. Black pieces are the hard stuff, the negative emotions, the negative statements, anxiety, shame, the thought I'm a failure. Most of us spend our lives believing we are the pieces. So we grab the white ones and try to defeat the black ones. We use positive thinking to try to crush self-doubt. And the battle never ends, does it? Because the mind's always producing more pieces. There's more actions to take. ACT offers a different possibility. What if you're not the pieces? What if you're not the one that's playing the game on either side? What if you're the board? The board holds every piece. The joy, the shame, the the confidence, the failure, without being damaged by any single one of them. It doesn't need one side to win in order to be whole. That's self as context. You're not the thought. You're the one noticing the thought. You're not the label. You're the context in which the label appears. Now let's make this practical. I want you to picture a guy named Jim, and he's an accountant whose whole identity is wrapped up in being a good provider. Now, one Tuesday afternoon, out of nowhere, he gets called into HR and loses his job. They give him a box to get his stuff, and he walks out to the car. You know, the whole scene. Now, path one, Jim fuses with it completely. The label slams down. If I'm not a provider, I'm a loser. And his whole identity becomes the loss. He goes home, closes the blinds so his neighbors won't see him, ignores texts from friends, doesn't touch his resume. That's path one. Path two, Jim still loses the job. He's still scared about the mortgage and the things he needs to provide. But instead of fusing, he uses self as process first. I'm noticing a wave of shame and humiliation right now. I'm noticing a lot of uncertainty about providing for my family. I'm noticing my mind telling me I'm a loser. Then he uses self as context. He steps back and remembers he's the board. Same job loss, same fear, same shame, here, same experiences, but one is fused and one is defused. And the difference is one of them, he has a choice of what he's going to do next. And he can more flexibly and easily move toward his values. Now, he's still feeling the sting of rejection and still texts his neighbor to ask about job leads. He opens up his resume and updates it. He's moving forward. Now, that's the goal of ACT, not to erase the pain, not to build a perfect self-image, and not to trade one label for a better one. The goal is psychological flexibility, the ability to notice what's happening inside of you and hold it with openness and choose your next values-based action. So here's the whole model together. Self as content is the story you tell yourself, useful until you fuse with it, until you see it as literally true. Then you have self as process, which is noticing the story as it happens instead of becoming the story. And then you have self as context, which is remembering you're not the pieces on the board. You are the board. You are the perspective. And there's plenty of room for whatever shows up. This is where the art of selfing comes in. Your mind is never going to stop creating a self story. I mean, that's not the goal. The goal is learning to notice when the story is useful and when it becomes a cage. So here's a simple practice for this week. Anytime you catch yourself saying, I am, followed by a painful label, pause and add one more phrase to front of it. I'm noticing the thought. I'm noticing the thought that I'm awkward. I'm noticing the thought that I always mess this up. That one phrase won't erase the feeling, but it loosens the grip. It reminds you that a thought is something you can notice, not something you have to obey. You are not the story. You are the space where the story shows up. And from that space, you get to choose what you do next. Now, if you like this video, I recommend downloading The Art of Selfing. That'll give you some more tools to utilize these 3 modes of the self.